What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video, and in today's video I'm going to be building a $750 gaming PC build that you can actually buy all of the parts for right now in 2021. In this video I'm going to talk you through all of the component choices, show how you can buy every single one of these parts and build this system for $750. So without any further ado, let's dive into it. I'm going to kick today's build off by installing the CPU cooler and the RAM before jumping into the GPU a bit later, which is the part I know you're all waiting excitedly for. One thing we need to do in this build is make as many cost savings as possible on components that aren't the graphics card. Those savings start with the motherboard, and we've selected Gigabyte's B450M S2H. They also have the DS3H and some good A320 options. This board though comes in around $60 and is a great choice, with some decent cooling for our VRMs, support for up to a Ryzen 9, not that I'd recommend you put a 5950X in this board, an M.2 slot for super fast future-proofed storage, and 2 RAM DIMM slots as well. It is simple, it is basic, but that's the whole point. We're going to be coupling it up with our CPU choice today. This is AMD's Ryzen 5 1600. The newer 1600AF is a better choice, but you can't find them right now. The 1600 is the next best thing. Ryzen 3 is also worth a look in, but once again, stock and availability of both the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X are a bit rubbish right now. And if anything, they're the paper launch that people haven't really been talking about. Moving on to the RAM for this build, and there's a few key rules you need to follow. You need to make sure you go for 16 gigabytes, as 8 gig is going to be a bit of a bottleneck, and you want to make sure you've got 2 RAM DIMMs for dual channel performance. This kit is also 3600 megahertz in speed, which is crucial for AMD Ryzen, and comes in from XPG. It's their Gamix D20 and can be very easily found on a wide range of retailers for around $89, which a couple of years ago would have been quite expensive, but now that's quite affordable, and these are a better option than more expensive RGB RAM DIMMs out there. They give us the all-important gaming performance we're after, which means they fit the bill very well for today's system. The final thing we want to install onto the motherboard is our CPU cooler, and that's where Ryzen once again comes in strong. This stock cooler comes included for free with basically every Ryzen CPU out there. It's not going to be quite as good as something like Cooler Master's Hyper 212 RGB, for example, but it saves us around $40 and will keep the CPU more than cool enough to get some great gaming performance. Typically, this will come with pre-applied thermal paste if it's brand new, but because I've used this one before, I just need to apply a dab of my own. Remember to connect up the 4-pin fan cable to the grey CPU fan header to make sure the fan spins and the processor stays nice and cool, but otherwise we're good to go, and we're ready to move the motherboard assembly into the case choice for today's build. This is an area where you could save even more money if you wanted to, but I would absolutely recommend you don't and go for this Cooler Master MB320AL instead. They also do a mesh MB311 out if airflow is more of a concern for you, but this is an awesome budget chassis. It's really well built. You've got plenty of airflow with 2 included RGB fans up front and a real tempered glass side panel. The case looks great. It's got plenty of room for a future GPU upgrade as well, so if you put a larger GPU in, something like a 3070, you're going to have no problems at all. You've even got a little bit of water cooling support if you want to upgrade this system with an AIO or something like that, which is just nice to have. One really cool feature about this case that it lends from higher end chassis is that the motherboard standoffs are slightly raised, and that holds the board pretty well into place while we go ahead and secure it down manually. Awesome stuff. That's now looking pretty good. The motherboard's in, and it brings us nicely onto the storage, the last component that we're going to install before taking a look at the graphics card. This is Seagate's Barracuda Q1. It's a great value 2.5-inch SSD, but other good options include the SanDisk SSD Plus or preferably the Kingston A400. A 480 gig SSD like this can be commonly found for $54, give or take. You might be able to find yourself a better deal if you do a bit of shopping around as well. So another area in today's build where you can save a little bit of cash. You might notice that I'm screwing in these kind of standoffs to the bottom of the drive. That's for a very simple reason. These are going to slot through the top of the power supply shield just over here to install the SSD into place. And it just sits very nicely like that. It's so simple. The next component then is the graphics card, and the part you've all been waiting for. This is a GTX 1650, but I know you're all asking, James, how much have you budgeted for this card? How did you buy this card? I'm about to reveal all. Now, I'm not going to say that we got some phenomenal deal on this GPU and managed to pick it up for RRP, because that's just complete and utter bullshit. Instead, we went onto eBay, and we're commonly seeing that these are selling secondhand for around about $280 US. I've actually budgeted for closer to 300, which in my opinion is easily enough to pick yourself up a 1650. Whether you're in the UK or the US on eBay, you should have some good luck at that price point. The reason I'd recommend this GPU over spending, $800 on a 20 or 3060 is because this isn't really going to lose too much of its value. Once GPU prices drop back to normal, it's quite easy to lose $500 or $600 on an overpriced 3060. But this thing is only about $150 over RRP, so if prices do fall back to normal, you're not losing $800. It's also more than powerful enough for gaming at 1080p in even the latest AAA titles. Yes, you can't use ray tracing, yes, you can't crank the settings up to ultra, but it's a fantastic GPU for gaming at medium settings while achieving 60 to 100 frames per second. As I say though, we'll take a deeper dive into performance a little bit later. First, let's get it installed into our case. It's going to look pretty diddy and pretty small, but it's the performance that matters. Not how big it is, how you use it, ladies and gentlemen. And then finally, all we need to do is just pop in the power supply, and that will round off our whole build today. The graphics card's really power efficient and doesn't need any power, so that's nice and simple. All we actually need to do is plug up power to the SSD, the CPU, and the motherboard power connectors. This is Cooler Master's MWE500, and it's an 80 plus white, as simple as they come power supply. It's going to be more than enough for our build and even a GPU upgrade if prices come back to normal. It's also a better option in my personal opinion than something like a Thermaltake Smart, which is a very common budget power supply, and I'd say even goes above and beyond the EVGA B series. With that being said, any of those options are decent and will be good enough for a build like this, but if you can go Cooler Master, then that's definitely the route I would recommend. And with that, we're pretty much done. There's just one or two things I do need to point out. We have added in an extra $10 case fan at the rear of the chassis. This is optional, but it will allow for better exhaust and make sure the airflow is just a little bit better in this case. And we also need to spend a bit of time just managing some of our cables away. You could go for some sleeved cable extensions, but I think spending $30, $35 on those in this build is a little bit of a waste of money, in my personal opinion. Either way though, let's get this system powered up, booted up, and see how it performs in some of the most popular titles out there. But first, how good it looks when it's all powered up in an epic glam montage. Roll the montage! Awesome stuff. Now we've seen just how good this system looks when it's all powered up, and we've covered off all of the components. Let's take a dive and see how exactly this in-stock gaming PC build actually performs. Before we take a closer look at some of our titles, on your screen now is a snapshot, a summary view of all the different games we tested with all of our different frame rates. You'll also find our temperature testing for both the CPU and the GPU to make sure things stay under control. Let's take a closer look at one or two of these titles though, kicking things off with GTA 5. Grand Theft Auto 5 is still one of the most popular titles out there right now, and for good reason. At 1080p high settings, tested out in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode, we got an impressive 94 frames per second on average, with 86 and 74 for the 90 and the 99th percentile results, meaning this system basically stayed above 74 FPS at all times. It's a similarly positive story in our next title today, Call of Duty's Black Ops Cold War, and we tested this game in the multiplayer zombies mode, as we figured that's the mode most of you guys at home will be using. At 1080p low settings, the game visually actually looked very, very good, surprisingly good in fact, and you can see that on your screen now. We got 64 frames per second on average, dipping down to 56 and 53 for the 90 and the 99th percentile results, but still sticking above that all-important 60 frames a second. That brings us nicely on to the next title today, Apex Legends, where we touched nearly 80 frames per second on average at 1080p medium settings. You could tune the settings down a bit further to get that, bit more FPS, but in this situation, we think this is the best balance. You'll be happy to know as well that the 99th percentile result was 65 frames per second, meaning we never dropped below the crucial 60 mark pretty much at any point in our gaming experience. The next game we tested out was Valorant. Definitely one of the easier to run games right now, but probably one of the most popular to use on a 1650. Here we got 242 frames per second. You heard me right, nearly 250 FPS on average in Valorant, with 207 and 194 for the 90 and the 99th percentile results. Now, the next game we tested out was mainly for a reference point, a bit of a laugh. It was, of course, Cyberpunk 2077, the penultimate title before we take a closer look at Fortnite in a moment's time. Here we got a pretty pathetic 34 frames a second, and our Ryzen 5 1600 and the 1650 just don't cut it for Cyberpunk. They meet the minimum requirements, but definitely not the recommended ones. You can play the game, it's just not going to be a very fun time, though that's more Cyberpunk's fault than it is our poor old 1650. And that brings us nicely on to the final title today, Fortnite. We tested at both 1080p high and 1080p competitive settings. At 1080p high settings, first of all, we got 64 frames per second on average, with 57 and 52 for the 90 and the 99th percentile results. That's actually not a bad result. But what about if we want to take our frame rate to the maximum? Well, at 1080p competitive settings, this is where you tune everything down to low, set your render distance to far, and disable DLSS if your graphics card supports it. Ours does not. And here we got an impressive 139 frames per second. That is a pretty astonishing result. A higher FPS than you'll get on a console, for example, as well, which is a huge win for a machine like this. And don't forget, if you pick up this build, you could easily swap out the 1650 for a 3060 once stock and pricing eventually normalizes to really supercharge your frame rate even further. And on that note, that pretty much wraps it up for today's build. If you did enjoy it, give it a big old like rating. Make sure to get subscribed. Thank you for watching though, and good luck buying those GPUs. Adios.